Introducing React, and yesterday we touched on creating essentially some vanilla JavaScript components, and what we noticed is that there was sort of a lot of repetition in our code. We had to do a lot of boilerplate type stuff when we wanted to mount something to our document. We also had to do a lot of state management kind of stuff, right? If we made any changes to our state, we had to manually then update what the DOM looked like. This is where React is going to come into play and make our lives a lot easier. With React, essentially we will be able to lay out how we want our page to look and let React worry about some of the details behind the scenes. So we could say, we want it to look in this specific way. Hey React, you make the code for us, okay? All right, so the first thing that I'm going to introduce to you guys is basically what React looks like in its raw form, okay? So if we go here, let me glance back at the schedule. I put a link on this for you guys here. The React CDN links are up here. And this is if we wanted to create an actual web page and just bring in the scripts that it takes to write a React application, okay? So I'm going to grab those scripts and we're going to create just a new HTML document and do it the old school, the raw way, all right?
What's the acronym for CDN?
Content Delivery Network. All right. So these are the development versions, and this is probably what you're going to want if you're actually creating an index.html like I am, because these ones are minified, which basically means that if you run into any errors, it's going to be virtually impossible for you to read and understand. So just grab the top two. Okay, and then I'll go into my terminal here, and I'm going to create a directory for what we're doing. So we'll call this Intro to React. And then I'm going to open that up in VS Code. Oops. Okay, so inside here, the first thing we want to create is just our index.html. Okay, and then we'll just drop in some boilerplate HTML there. Now I want to load up these scripts, so I can paste those in there. Cool. And then the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a spot where I actually want to mount my React application. Okay? So typically this is going to be a div that you put in there. So I'll just say div, and then I'm going to give it an ID of root. You can name that whatever you like. But we will use that ID at some point later in our code, so I'll make mention of it. So here, what we want to do after we've created this root div is we're also going to want to load in our own JavaScript file where our main React code is, right? So I'm just going to open up a little script tag here, and then I'm going to say the source will be index.js. Okay, I don't have that file currently, so let's go ahead and make that. Index.js. Cool. All right, now what I want to do is I basically just want to create a React element that we'll be able to put inside this little root div. Okay? And the way that we do that is we have this function called createElement, just like yesterday we were doing document.createElement. Now we can say react.createElement. Okay, and I'm going to save that to a variable. So I'll just say const div equals react.createElement. Okay? And when we invoke this function, we need to say what kind of element we're creating. So I'm saying let's just create a div tag, right? That's always fun. Okay? And then the second argument that we need to provide it is going to be this props object that we were talking a little bit about yesterday, right? I'm just going to make it an empty object at this point. And if you guys remember, the third thing that we were, or one of the things in our props object that we were working with yesterday is this thing called children, right? It's whatever appears inside our element. So here, if I want my div to say hello world, I can actually put that as the children. Cool. All right, now I need to actually get that on my page. So if we were doing this in vanilla JavaScript, what would the next line of code be? Yeah, so how were we doing that? We were doing document.body.append, right? So we were appending it to the body element. So in this case, what we're going to do is we have this other script that we loaded. So there were two of them, right? This one is React itself, and then this one is React DOM. So that's specific to viewing things in a browser. The React DOM is what's going to allow us to actually attach this thing that we created to our document object model. All right.
So, out of curiosity, when you use third argument passing,
yeah.
What's the difference between passing in that argument versus what's the word to use? Attaching another element to the element you just created. It's the same thing as a child, right?
Yeah, so we could do that, and I think we'll get into that in a second. But for right now, all we're doing is we're dropping a string. I'll set it up kind of in a few minutes where we nest another element inside that. Okay. All right. So what we want to do to mount this to our DOM is we're going to say React DOM, which is that other script that we imported, right? And we're going to call this render function. The render function is going to take the element that we want to render, which is going to be div in this case. And then the second argument is where do we want it to render. Okay? So where did we say we wanted it to render? In this div that has an ID of root. So how can I get a reference to that?
An ID,
Hashtag root. Right? Yeah. What's the actual syntax though? Yeah. Let's do document.getElementById, right? Very good. So here, and I'll kind of separate the arguments by line too, so that it's a little easier to read. Whoops. Okay, is that? Hopefully that's big enough. All right, cool. So here, as the second argument, what we're going to say is document.getElementById, and then I'm just going to pass in root. Okay. So now, if I open up this page, what's gonna happen is that our browser is going to parse all of this stuff, and then when it hits this script right here, it's going to load that up and start going through our index.js, right? So at that point, it should create that div for us, and then the second thing in that file is let's mount it up to the DOM. All right, let's try it out. Let's go over here. Okay, so that's it. Hello world. If I change this here, I should see something else. Again. All right. Now what Isaiah was asking about is, could we potentially nest components in here? And yes, we can. So let's do that real quick. So back in our index.h.js, let's create another nested element. So we'll say const p equals react.createElement, and let's just create a p tag. Okay, and then what do we want this to say? This is our p tag. Okay. Now what I'll do is I'll move this div down here because I want the p tag to be nested inside of it. And then instead of passing in hello world as the third argument, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in that p tag. Okay? So if we were to actually inspect these elements here, we would see that now we have this nested structure, right? So I've got my p tag inside this div that I created. That's nesting a component, right? Real quick, also, how can we add some kind of an event listener here? What if I wanted to handle a click on this this p tag? Remember yesterday we were passing in some functions that we wanted to run on certain events. Now React gives us something called onClick. Okay, so if we pass this onClick property inside this this props object, we can say, what do we want to happen if I actually click on this element? So lo and behold, I'm going to create a nice little arrow function here for you guys. More practice, right? Console.log clicked on div. Okay. Now notice here, if I have no expected arguments here, I can just have an empty set of parentheses. And I'm just going to console log that. All right, let's go back and test it out. Refresh the page. Go to our console to check this. And there we go. You can see every time I click on the div, it's actually telling me that it happened, right? So that's how we would add an event listener when we're inside of React. You think it's nice? I do too. Pretty cool, right? So we don't have to kind of go through that boilerplatey code of saying add event listener, click, give it a function, right? It's a little bit more, it's simpler syntax, okay? The other nice thing about using React's event listeners is that it actually cleans up for us when it's done. Now the code that we were writing yesterday, what if I destroyed that counter component that we were working with? If I just removed it from the DOM, what would happen at that point to those event listeners that we set up? Break. I'm hearing different things. Break? What would break specifically?
Well, there would be no be undefined. You wouldn't have they wouldn't know what to do. You remove the counter.
Yeah, so I mean, there would be no use in having them still be present, right? Mm-hmm. But the thing is, JavaScript is going to keep them around in memory even after I've destroyed those elements. Mm-hmm. Because we didn't manually remove the event listener. So imagine what a pain in the butt that would be every time I remove something from the DOM. I also need to remove all those event listeners. Otherwise, I've got this constantly expanding memory footprint because JavaScript's hanging on to everything that I attached. React, on the other hand, is that once we unmount these components, it's automatically going to clean up all of those event listeners for us. So again, it's doing a lot of this work behind the scenes that we don't have to worry about. All right. However, what did we lose here when we were writing this? Like, does this look like very friendly syntax? It's still kind of heavy on the JavaScript element, right? Does it look like we're writing HTML?
No.
Not so much, right? Very JavaScripty. But what I wanted to point out is that ultimately, when we run our React code, because we're gonna learn about a different way to write our React code, that's going to be a lot friendlier. But ultimately, what that code is going to be boiled down to is something that looks kind of like this. All right. So behind the scenes, it's going to boil down our code into something that the browser can actually understand. All right. Which is this, which is just pure JavaScript. But we're gonna see shortly a new way to write React syntax, which is just much easier on the eyes, much easier to work with. Okay? Any questions about this before we move on, though? Yes.
I went to the website that you went to and typed in CDN, but I couldn't find the 2 links.
Did you just click on the one that I put in the schedule?
Oh, no.
Yeah, just click on the link that I put in the schedule for you. Easiest that way. All right. Any other questions about kind of technically what was going on here? All right, I'm gonna have somebody read some code. Paul, what's happening on line 1?
Creating a key tag.
Come on, you can do better than that.
Uh,
So just start from the beginning. So what's happening here?
Create a variable called p.
Good. Declaring a constant variable p. All right. Assigning it to what?
Creating an element.
Okay. So it's the result of invoking this function called create element, right? And what are we passing into create element?
P variable.
Okay. So it's a p string, which means that we're creating a p tag. That's the type of HTML element we're creating, right? This is what? This is just an empty object. It's got no key value pairs in it, right? Okay, cool. And then this right here.
What would be this word? Or we want the p tag.
So the third argument is going to be the children, whatever's going to be inside that p tag, right?
What is this empty object for?
It's going to be for some properties, and later on we'll see how to use those a little bit better. But we didn't want that p tag to have any specific properties, right? We weren't trying to attach an on-click handler to it in this case, so it's just an empty object. Okay. All right. AJ, go ahead and read line 3 for me.
Declare a div and make a element, div element, and it's React.
Good. So we're creating a div tag, right? Good.
And we use the object again.
Good. So that's our props object that we've been talking about a little bit.
And inside that, whenever we click on this div, we get something in our console.
Okay. So the onClick is going to be set to a function, right? It's going to be just an anonymous arrow function, and then inside the body of that function, I'm just console logging clicked on div. That's it. All right. And then this third argument here means what?
A p tag.
Okay.
That comes, that p tag that we declared.
So this means that we're nesting this p tag up here inside this div. Okay, that's what, because that argument is for the children. Okay, so if we put a child inside there, we are now nesting the p tag inside the div. All right, good. Shazé, line 7.
React DOM render, which is rendering a page, and inserting div and getting document get element by ID, the root that we linked from index.js.
Okay.
Or in index.
Yeah, so what this is going to do, whereas before we were appending child, right? What this is going to do is it's actually going to completely replace the contents of that root div, okay, with our React application in this case. All right? Good.
Quick question for me.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. All right, you first since you started talking.
For the third argument again, is that only a single child, or do you pass in like some list of children? For
Yeah, you could pass in a list as well. Yeah.
It's gonna be.
And we're actually going to do that when we move on to the other way of expressing our React. So we'll kind of see it more visually.
Okay.
In this example, we have only one p tag and one div, right?
Mhm.
Is there a way to give the p tag and the div an ID inside the JavaScript?
Yeah, you can apply that.
Where?
You should be able to put that inside the props. Let's test it though. So in here, whoops. If I want my p tag to have an ID, let's just say ID.
I thought you did.
Oh yeah, sorry. Wrong spot. Okay, so in here, let's just say ID is p tag go back and inspect our elements, you could see that our p tag does indeed have that ID, right? Cool.
You could probably do either, right? ID or class.
Well, it depends. Are we talking about for stylistic purposes? Because you want to.
Purposes probably.
Yeah, generally, if you're going to style something in React, we'll typically be using classes, not so much IDs.
Instead of ID,
Yeah.
you use class, right?
Yep. All right. Was there another question over here?
Same question.
Oh, it's the same one. Okay, cool. All right, so let's move on. We've done kind of like the unfriendly way of doing React. Now what we want to do is the friendly way. Yeah. Time to get to some more I don't know, more user-friendly kind of way of doing it. So we're going to use this thing called Create React App. Okay? So what the developers for React have done is they've created this boilerplate project that allows you to get up and running with React very quickly, and it also gives us access to this newer type of syntax, something called JSX. Okay? What that is it's basically a JavaScript syntax expansion, or extension, I should say. So it means that we can still write JavaScript inside of our React files, but we'll be able to express the HTML that we want to show up on the page in a way that looks more like HTML. Okay? So before you guys can use Create React App, you're going to have to install Node on your computers. Hopefully you guys have done this. Let me have a show of hands. How many of you guys have installed Node already? Most of you? Okay. All right, so if we've got Node installed, what I can do is I can run this command npx create react app, okay? And that's going to call this specific library that I was talking about, create react app, which is going to create the whole shell for our application for us. Then the third thing that we need to say is, what is the name of our project, okay? So I'll just call this CRA intro. And then it's going to do a whole bunch of stuff for us. Okay, this is Create React App actually creating our application. And also, one other thing too, Code Sandbox, which we were using yesterday, they allow you to create React apps in this same way, and it sort of uses Create React App under the hood. Okay, so if you're in Code Sandbox and you're working on some React project, you can also export it so that you can use it on your local machine. You know, it's just a regular React app. Is this done yet? Oh, here we go. Happy hacking. Look at that. All right, cool. So let's open it up in VS Code. So code, CRA intro. All right, and let's take a look at what they've given us here. So we've got this node modules folder. Okay, you guys won't really need to worry about that too much right now, but basically that houses all the libraries that are being used by our project. So if I pop this open, you'll see it's quite robust. The reason why it's so big is because for every dependency, that dependency may also have its own dependencies. So by the time everything gets installed, you'll see in the node modules folder it gets quite large. So if you guys are ever sharing code on GitHub or anywhere else, make sure that you git ignore your node modules folder, because otherwise it's going to blow up your repository. All right, make it really big. The other thing that we've got is this public folder. The public folder is something that you're not really going to need to mess with, but basically React is generating, Create React App is going to generate the contents of that folder for you dynamically. And then finally, the most important folder here that you guys will be working with is the SRC folder. That's our source. That's where all of our main code goes. So let's open up this app.js here. Actually, no, sorry. Let's open up the index.js first. And then let me just close this sidebar here. Does this look pretty familiar as far as what we were just doing? React DOM.render, right? So let's see what's going on here. We're importing React. We're importing React DOM, which is actually going to mount up our application. And then we're also importing some CSS here. Not super important, but it is. And then here, we're importing app from app. Let's see what app is. So if I go back to my sidebar here, open up app, here's what I've got. Okay? So I'm importing React. I'm also importing a logo and an app.css. Okay, just some styling, no big deal here. Now what's this? It's a function that seems to be returning some HTML. Well, that's pretty interesting, right? So this is what I was talking about. This is the JSX that we were saying, which is going to give us the ability to write JavaScript in a way that it actually looks like HTML. Class name. Does that look a little weird to you guys? It should. No, it doesn't. Yeah, no, you might have seen it somewhere, but basically, like, normally if I'm writing HTML, I would just say class equals whatever, right?
The class is used in JavaScript.
That's the thing. Class is actually a keyword in JavaScript, so we have to say class name when we're working in React. Okay? All right. Now, what's the other thing that we notice here is that some of these things, normally we'd have an image src equals, but here I have some curly braces. What that means is that we're actually inputting some kind of a JavaScript expression. Okay? Because logo, as you guys can see here, is actually a variable, right? So if I want to put that as the source, I need to surround it by curly braces. That's kind of one of the big things I want you guys to get from the first JSX exposure.
All right, can you show us a file?
You mean like what it looks like when we're done?
No, right now it just says logo, right? On the top
You want
it
to
says
see that
logo.
actual logo file?
No. There is no function besides that?
That's the main thing that's exporting, right? Export default app. It's exporting that function. That's it. And then where were we using the function? Back in index.js. Right? So over here in index.js, we're importing that. And then you can see here, we're rendering app. This is how, when we're using JSX, we can specify components rather than by the name like we were doing before. We can actually put them inside these angle brackets like we're used to with HTML. Okay? But probably the first few times you see this, it's going to look really weird because we're using this type of syntax inside of JavaScript. Now understand that your browser can't understand this by itself. We're using something that's boiling it down to basic JavaScript like what we were looking at before. Okay? The other thing I want you to notice here is that there's this is a self-closing element. Okay? So when we're working in React, this is really important that you guys self-close certain elements that you're probably used to not closing. Things like inputs, HR tags, BR tags. They all need to have that self-closing slash. Otherwise, you're going to get an error in the browser. Okay? All right. So let's actually run this guy so that we can see what's happening. So I'll open up my terminal here. And then you guys will notice if you look inside your package.json here, there's a little scripts object here. Some different scripts that we can run. So I've got a script that I can run called start. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to say npm run start. Okay? And then you can see now it's essentially building up our project for us. It created all of the folder structures, but now it needs to actually compile the code. Whoa, there it is. Yeah, pretty fancy, right? We've got like some animation on an SVG logo. Nice. All right. What if I wanted to change that, though? If I just want to rip out some of that code? So I can go into this app.js here, and I can take out everything. Okay, and I can create my own div here. And then inside that, we'll just say hello from create React app. All right. Whoa, look at that. I got hot reloading too. Okay? So notice how I didn't refresh this page at all, but React then rebuilt it for me on the spot. So I already had the code that I just changed right there. Cool. Let's do something else. So let's create a button inside here. Oops. And then inside, yes? I can do what? We're not getting into animations right now. But yes, you can, of course. All right, so, what? No, we're not going to do animations. We're trying to keep it simple, just giving you guys like a basic intro to React. Okay, so we want to have like a click handler on this button, right? Okay, so let's add that. I can do on click, and notice how I can just add this as I do any kind of regular HTML attribute. But because this is going to be a JavaScript expression, I need to use these curly braces. Okay? So inside here, I'm just going to create a little arrow function. And I'm going to console log clicked. Okay? Notice how I'm getting, I don't know if you guys can see this very well, but I'm getting a red underline under here, right? And so what it's telling me is that JSX expressions must have one parent element. I don't have one parent element right here, right? I've got a div, and I've got a button, but there's nothing surrounding it. So I need to have just one element surrounding everything. Okay. There are two ways that I can fix that problem. The first one is that I can actually surround it with an element. So if you go Command-Shift-P and then wrap with abbreviation, I can wrap this with a div, like that. Okay? And then that would work. So if I go back here, go to my app, and then go to my console, you can see if I click on this guy here, it's telling me it was clicked, right? Okay, so that's working. The other thing that I can do if I don't want to actually add another div tag to my document, I can use what's called a fragment. So if I delete this div tag here, and I basically just leave empty angle brackets like this, that creates a fragment, and React will be okay with that. Yeah, kind of nice. Yeah, it's helpful when again, you don't want to add more divs to things, right? I mean, it kind of reminds me of Bootstrap sometimes, like divs on divs on divs, right? We don't want to just keep nesting things too deeply. Yes, I
So
did.
what notates, I guess, what notates in this React project that a file should be interpreted as a data set?
So under the hood, Create React App is using this bundler called Webpack. And what Webpack is doing is it's transpiling this JSX code that we've written into actual JavaScript for us.
Right, then we have to notate whatever we're trying to convert to JavaScript code. So it skips that portion.
It skips which portion?
And like with the curly brackets, so that JavaScript code is
This right here? Yeah.
So
Yeah,
this-
exactly. It's telling it, this is a JavaScript expression right here.
Right, but then, because you have like multiple files in the source folder,
Mhm.
and I'm guessing some of them is actually interpreted as JS, and some of them interpreted as JS. So then, where do you notate which file gets interpreted as what?
Actually, Webpack is trying to parse basically all of the source files that it's going through. It's going to try to parse as JSX. But if there's no actual JSX in it, It's just going to stay, vanilla JavaScript like it was.
Okay. So default.
So basically, like if I have a file that doesn't have any of this type of JSX inside of it, it'll just return out what the contents of that file already were, right? Because there's nothing to actually change.
So it's automatic.
Yeah.
It's automatic. It doesn't
Yeah.
itself.
Which is so confusing.
It's only
But I
gonna
get
it's
it.
only gonna change the things that need to be changed, essentially,
Okay.
right?
Yeah, no, I get it. It's just because this is one of those like when you're not like tacitly doing something. Yeah, I'll play around with it.
Okay. Yeah. So let's talk about how we can kind of split things up a little bit. So right now I've got a couple things in here. What if I wanted to create one of those increment counters like we were working with yesterday, right? I can actually create a special component that I can reuse throughout my application for doing that. So to create a component, let's just create a little folder that will house our components. And then inside that, I'm going to create a counter. All right? Now, every time I create a React component that's actually going to render something to the screen, I need to import React itself. Okay? So it should look like that. Import React from React. Okay. Now, the other thing that I'm going to do is, because this counter is going to have some state in it, and I'll talk about that in a second, I want to use a React class, at least for now. Later on, we'll learn a different way of doing it, but I'm going to create a React class. Okay. So let's do it like this. We'll say class counter extends react.component. Okay? Anybody know what this extends means?
Coming from
So it means that we're inheriting from this, right? So we're inheriting from this class, which is react.component. Okay? And then inside that, I'm going to have a constructor function. When does the constructor function run? When the object is created, right? You guys remember that? All right. So my constructor is going to take in props, that object that we've been talking about a little bit, right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to run super against those props. You guys remember what super means?
is that for scope?
How so? What do you mean?
Does super have anything to do with the layers of scope?
So what super is doing is actually calling the constructor function of the parent class. Okay? So in other words, we're now calling the constructor function of this component class. And then we're passing in those same props that our component is taking in. Okay? Now what I want to do is I want to create a state object, which is just going to basically say how many times has this thing been clicked. All right? So we'll say this dot state, and then it's going to be an object. So inside this object, I'm going to say clicked, and then I'll just say 0 on that guy. All right. Okay, now when we create a React class, we also need to have a method inside here called render. What the render method is going to do is it's going to say, what do we want this component to look like in terms of our HTML, right? So I'm going to create this render method. And then the render method is going to have to return JSX. So we'll say return. And then inside here, you guys can do parentheses. I'm just going to put a button inside there. And then what I'm going to say is clicked something times. Now inside my JSX, again, what do the curly braces mean? No, not props. It's going to be a JavaScript expression of some sort, right? Okay. So the place that I'm getting that from is going to be from the state. So I'm going to say this dot state dot clicked.
escape when you're using a bracket inside your JavaScript?
No. No, because remember, this is JSX, right?
Right.
So all I'm doing is I'm just saying I want whatever's inside these curly braces to be replaced by the value of that expression.
Okay. So then if I'm, because it just grabs the first one and the last one it sees, I guess. So if I'm trying to make a reference to some object.
What do you mean the first and the last one it
Oh,
sees?
so let me take a step back just for the base question.
Okay.
If we're notating embedded JavaScript with curly brackets,
Okay.
within the JavaScript code, I have to use curly brackets. Do I need to make like some escape notation, or I can just flat out use it?
No, you don't need to escape this in any way. That's fine.
No, he's asking if there's curly brackets inside the
Inside of that,
curly
if you're gonna use.
Oh, what you would do, so if you wanted literal curly braces, you would put them inside quotes, like this. It would be something like this. Like if I wanted to concatenate a curly brace to whatever this value was,
Okay.
you'd do it inside of a string.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Okay, cool. So let's stick with what we had though. We just want the number of clicks to show up. All right. Now remember, I haven't exported this class yet from this file, right? So in order for me to use it in a different file, I need to export it. So let's do that. So let's export default, bless you, counter. Okay, and then inside my app, I'm going to import that counter, right? So we'll say import counter from, and I'm going to go from the current directory and then go into my components directory and then grab that counter file, right? Okay. So here, if I want to render out, let me just get rid of what we have right now. As people run to the door. All right, so I'm just going to render out this counter component, and that's it, right? Okay, there we go. So it's clicked 0 times. Now, is this doing anything for me, though?
No.
Not doing anything, right? Because I have not added that click handler. All right. So the way that we can do that is inside of our counter component, let's create a handler, and the way that we do that is by adding an attribute here, onClick. Okay. Now to the onClick function, I need to actually provide something. So I'll just create a little method here inside my class, handle, oops, click. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to change the state of my application to actually update that counter, right? Instead of just doing that the way that you might think, like, is this kind of how you guys would think we might want to do that? Right? This is sort of what makes sense, is let's just increment this thing directly. Do not do that in React, okay? We don't want to be altering the state directly. Instead, we're going to call this method called setState. All right. So we'll go this.setState. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide an object here that has the key name that I want to change. So I want to change clicked, right? And then I'm going to say this.state.clicked plus 1. Okay? Does this part make sense to you guys? This.state.clicked? Remember, this is just the value of how many times that thing's been clicked. Okay. All right, and then finally what I want to do is just drop that in here. So I'm just going to say this.handle click. Okay, so hopefully this thing's re-rendered for me. And if I click on this, whoa, woohoo! Yeah. So what's it telling me is undefined right now?
I think it's
No,
the handle
it's not
play-
saying set state is undefined, right?
the handle
Please
play
word it.
function.
The property.
What's undefined, guys?
The method return off.
No.
You have to import the set state.
Nope.
Well, it's line 13 of counter
Can't read property set state of undefined. Set state was supposed to be a property of this. Whoa, this is undefined? Holy moly. All right, so what we need to do, there are two ways of fixing this issue. Either we can bind our method up here inside of our constructor. This is one way. So I can say this.handleClick equals this.handleClick.bind to this. That's pretty gnarly, right? All right, so let's try that again. Okay, so now it's working. But good grief, did anyone see what was going on here? So I'm saying this.handleClick, this method is going to be equal to binding that method to this. So I'm creating a new bound version of the function up here inside the constructor. Yeah, it's kind of sucky. Let's see if we can do that in a better way. Let's see if I can turn handleClick into an arrow function. Okay. And lo and behold, that works just the same. Because when we're working with arrow functions, the context of this is actually taken from the surrounding scope of my class. So now it properly reflects that this is referring to this actual object.
I guess then like that's one of the things I've always wondered from more like conceptual perspective. So like you have like class variables and class functions and object properties and object functions. And that's the entire thing we're talking about binding it to the constructor. So it has a property or it has a function of that object. So when you're actually interacting with it, it knows what handle click is. Because without that, it handle click is just class function.
Well, because what was happening is we just didn't have reference. The reason why is because we're extending a parent class, right? And in this case, the parent class doesn't have a method called handleClick. It does have a method called render, and it obviously has a constructor as well. So notice how we were able to reference this inside this render method, and we were also able to reference it inside the constructor. The reason why we couldn't reference it inside handleClick is because the parent class doesn't have that method. So, again, there were these two ways that we could fix it. We could either bind it to the this that was available inside of our constructor, and then it would be bound later on. Or we could simply turn it into an arrow function, in which case this is taken from the surrounding scope. Now I recognize that this stuff is probably going to be pretty confusing. So I would say at this point, use the arrow functions. That'll probably make it a lot easier for you guys to work with. Okay? All right, any questions before we break and get to some assignments? Yes.
I guess I'm just still confused about super. I'm still trying to grasp it.
All right. How about a classmate who feels pretty good about OOP trying to explain super? Anybody? Nobody? All right, fine. So what super's doing is it's just calling the constructor function of the parent class. Okay, so this is our constructor function here in this class, but also this component class that we're extending from has its own constructor. So that's all that we're doing in that case. Make sense?
Yeah.
Yes, AJ.
When you wanted to run it, you use a script that was start. What was the other script inside there? There was a
So build is when you actually want to, typically when you want to deploy your app, when you want to put it on the server or something. So that will create a minified production build, which is much, much smaller. Takes a little bit longer, but it kind of bakes things down to something really small. Test, if you have some tests. Eject is kind of interesting. What eject does is it basically says, I no longer want this to be a create React app. I want it to be my own app that I have 100% control over. And you can actually then make changes to the Webpack configuration once you've ejected. But it's like a one-way street. Once you've ejected, you can't return that thing into a create React app again. You're out of create React app. But sometimes it can come in handy if you really want to have more control over the project. Because create React app is very opinionated and it comes with things structured in a certain way. If you want to make some deep changes to the code in the Webpack configuration, you may want to eject. You guys won't have to do that here, though. Yes?
So if you eject, does that mean it converts the files and the whole folder structure to something different?
No.
Or
No. All of that stuff will still look the same.
okay.
It'll just be that you have access to the internals of it. And
Okay.
you can tweak things even further. Yeah. Other questions? You guys feel okay about JSX? Was it weird?
So if you accidentally eject, you can't use Create React anymore?
Well, not for that app.
So you have to reinvent.
Yeah, the eject is like it's a one-way street. You know, it's like once you're off the React app, you're done with that particular project.
So does it keep a copy of it that you can later on use?
Revert? No.
No, not revert, but like a version that you can still use within the Create React app and a version that no longer is attached.
No, it's once it's ejected, you're off entirely.
Yeah.
You can still run it the same way. You can still go, npm run start, and that'll work fine. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Now, if you obviously if you're using Git or some type of version management, you should be able to create a version that's like a React app before you eject, right?
Right.
Then you could theoretically get back to where you were.
Yeah.
Okay.
If
Yeah.
you comment
Don't
that
worry
out-
too much about ejecting, though. You guys aren't going to use it here.
In that file, if you comment anything else, it will stop working, right? Or not.
Yeah, if I comment out this script here, it means that I can no longer use it. Now that's not really valid JSON, so it doesn't really like that. But yeah, if one of these scripts weren't here, then I wouldn't be able to run npm run eject, right? So that's where it's looking for. When you say npm run and then some name after that, it's going to look inside your scripts object for that name. Yep. All right, good. All right, let's break. Let's do some assignments, and then I'll figure out something to go over with you guys in the afternoon.
Are we doing the script Olympics?
No.